The Grand Covenant, and again, if we're thinking about time immemorial here, everything to the north of that large canyon there, that's generally imperial territory. That was only recently subsumed in the last 15 years. So, I mean, 0.1% of Atherosian history as this area here belonged to the Covenant. However, it's been an incredibly corrupting force in that time. We'll talk about that now. So, of course, the creator of the Thupp is Thupp himself, the little small magical wizard. But Thupp didn't really have a mind to rule his people. He was not a ruler in the traditional sense. That wouldn't come until later when the Thulians would come to be. Now, Thub Thul, the preeminent Thulian, was a diplomat, and they did create, shall we say, a government. They created what would later become kind of like the Grand Covenant. I'm trying to remember the name of the people that they founded. I think at first the order was just the Thulians, and then they became a race, and then there was an order that they founded as well. But that later became subsumed by the Grand Covenant. So if we want to think of a political godfather or god spirit, parent, whatever, for the Grand Covenant, we'd be looking at Thub Thul. They're also the ones whose memory the Grand Covenant was more or less founded in place of. Of course, Thupp is the spiritual being that blesses the Grand Covenant with his approval. That's what that covenant is, right? It's the covenant between the Thuppish races, or I guess the Thupp, the Thul, and the Tharg, saying we unilaterally we serve good and thuppy things. So although it's founded to honor the spirit of Thupp and that covenant that he made with them, politically the structure that oversees them was left in place by Thub Thul. I guess the other part of that would be Cardan Roarke, the Tharg, which are a warlike race that the Thupp and the Thul made to defend themselves from the threats to the north. They are overseen, or I suppose were. He died last year. Again, a lot of Avatar deaths recently, but they were ruled over the Avatar, ruled over by the Avatar Cardan Roarke. There are also Thargish houses. Basically, the Thargish legions, if you will, are divided into houses which have kind of like different citadels spread throughout the Covenant land, right? So you might have the House Hull over here, and they're ruled over by this Thargish patriarch. And then if there's ever a deployment that needs to be made, then the patriarchs would come together and under Cardan Roarke's direction, they would say, all right, we're going to deploy these houses here, those houses there. Or we don't need to deploy anybody. Let's call up some regulars from the Kulins and see if we can get any humans to solve this problem for us. So as far as the rulership, that's kind of the traditional rulership of the Grand Covenant. The Grand Covenant itself is overseen by a patriarch. Their religious authority and their political authority are one in the same. So if you are good at interpreting the will of Thupp and knowing what things are appropriately Thuppy, if you're good at pranks and being one step ahead of people, then you're effectively then going to be a good politician as well, right? If you're good at being Thuppy, you'll be a good politician. Like, the two are just one and the same in the Covenant mind. There isn't really a distinction between the two. If you have guile, if you can manipulate people, if you can think around and outside of the box, then you're the person for the job. This, however, got them into, or is continuing to get them into, a little bit of trouble, as one might imagine. It creates a lot of opportunity for manipulating schemers to rise to the top. One of those manipulating schemers is now named Thub Thul, but he was initially named Othrup. Othrup the Wise. In a previous talk, in a previous lore conversation, we had quite a bit of information about Othrup. But more or less, he is a Thulian diplomat who is trying to end the war with the Empire, right? Of course, he stands for good. The Empire takes slaves, they raid people, they do all sorts of terrible things and other things along those lines. However, there might be more profit, shall you say, in peace, right? And he's not really alone in thinking this. There's quite a few people that have this mind. So over time, when Castle Blatt is taken, it should be said too that the patriarch that he was serving at the time died under very questionable circumstances when his son, not Othrup's son, but the old patriarch, the patriarch's son was very young. So Othrup was made regent until the son would be old enough. How convenient for Othrup. So now that he's on the throne, he starts to pull some different political levers, starts to communicate more with different imperial politicians. Once the war is over, he becomes incredibly corrupt. He starts to fill the council in Covenant, the Covenant Council, later they'd call it the Thesaurium, but right now on the map it's called Castle Blatt. But the new name that they call it is Thesaurium. After the war, he becomes the money man. He's put in charge of distributing Glacia's vast wealth to the rest of the nation. So being put in charge of the institution called the Mork Trading Company, and they're the ones that distribute it, but also the Thesaurian, they're the ones that accumulate and account for all the wealth in there. It's an incredibly powerful job with a lot of opportunity to skim stuff off the top. I mean, think about it. He's the one that's in charge of saying, oh, this is how much is in the treasury right now. Right? Like, oh, this is how much is in this section of the treasury. This is how much we've moved out through here. This is how much money we need to pay these contractors over here. Oh, and he's the one also in charge of choosing those contractors as well. Like, it's a position that comes with so much ability to make oneself rich and to make one's associates rich. And that is exactly what he is doing and what he did. About a year ago, around the same time that Cardan Roarke died, he found evidence, oh, wouldn't you know it, that Leandros, the young patriarch-to-be, was actually a bastard. And so he was ineligible to sit on the throne of the Covenant as patriarch. So, to smooth things over, Othrup decided to step in as patriarch. It just seemed like the easiest thing to do. The Cardinal Council voted him in, and bing, bang, boom, there you go. Now he's the patriarch. Just so happened he had a lot of friends on the Cardinals Council, too. So, hey, that's pretty handy. The thing is, he also renames himself, too. So he's no longer Othrup. He is now Thub Thul. Thub Thul the 11th, I believe. So within the last 30 years or so, Othrup the Wise kind of like single-handedly took the Covenant governance, which until now was really pretty naive, and completely modernized it. He was also the one who, like 50 years ago, I should say 80 years ago even, when they were trying to think of new ways to continue to defend themselves against the Empire to the north, he was the one that told the old patriarch, hey, you know what we should do? build a bunch of towns here, invite a bunch of humans here from the north, and then they will grow up and they can defend us. So he was the architect of that immense human migration that caused the Kulins to form, and then also in turn supplied the humans that would come back and defeat the Empire and retake Foundrin many years later. So say what you will about how corrupt he is and how ambitious and how scheming he is. He's also the grand architect of a movement that preserved the free human culture as we know it. If not for his actions, humanity might have been just totally defeated and enslaved after the Empire sacked Foundrin and killed the second Bork. Like, that might have been it. But he had the foresight to, 30 years before that, set up this separate kind of quasi-sovereign human kingdom within the Covenant that did exactly what he wanted to, exceeded his expectations. So, like, as far as being a politician and a political schemer and getting what he wants, he is right up there near the top. But Varthus is also aware of Othrup's. He's aware of Thub Thul's actions here, right? Because Varthus, not only does he have great imperial intelligence is unrivaled throughout the land, but also he knows ambition and greed when he sees it. He's an ambitious and greedy man himself, and he has his own intent to use Thub Thul's ambition and greed to his own devices. Already in written history, you can go and look into the lore. Within a few years here, the Grand Covenant will become another imperial province, and Thub Thul will become its provincial governor. So, and this is, the gears are already in motion here. And again, Thub Thul, he's sitting here, he's got his eyes on the imperial throne, right? He's thinking, Emperor Thul, that has a nice ring to it. Thinking like, I managed to expand the Covenant territories by quite a bit after the war, but I bet we could expand them even more. You know, like, he's ambitious. He is ruthless and cunning and guileful, and as soon as he breaks through one ceiling, he creates another one for himself. And after having deposed Leandros, even with the rebellion that will form within the Covenant, he has no intent of slowing down or of stopping. He's just going to continue reaching for power and finding thuppy ways to eliminate anyone who gets in his way. So, and one thing to note, too, is I mentioned before kind of how this is the age of mortals, right? In the past, you had those three avatars of the Grand Covenant kind of overseeing it. You had the Spirit of Thupp overseeing it. You had Cardan Roarke overseeing the Thargish houses. And then you had whoever the Thulian Patriarch was, right? Whoever was in charge of the Grand Covenant overseeing that Thul side of things. But now, fast forward to the Age of Mortals, Thupp, he's going to drop his blessing on the Covenant here. And Cardan Roarke is dead. So those two kind of spiritual powers that balanced out that political center, right? Like the left and the right wing, if you will, those are gone. And now all that's left is this political center. And the influence that the Patriarch, Thub Thul in this case, is able to exert on the entire Covenant at this point is unparalleled so far in Covenant history. Like, the only time you had this much unification behind a single avatar in the Covenant lands was before Thub Thul was even around. Because, you know what, there might be a lot of people that worship the Patriarchy, but there's still going to be a lot of the traditionalists that worship Thupp. And there's going to be a lot of there's always still the Tharg. Of course, they worship Cardan Roarke, and they follow his orders. But now the houses Tharg are so steeped in corruption because of all the time that Othrup has had to put his people into place. And the old traditionalists have lost so much of their political power that they're basically just an impotent joke at this point. Like, he's unquestionably the ruler of the Grand Covenant. Of course, he always, the patriarch of the Grand Covenant always is, in name, the ruler of the Grand Covenant, but there's always still those checks on his power of the leader of the military and their spiritual leader of Thupp. But those are just pretty much gone at this point. So that's the rulers of the Grand Covenant. These next ones